This is part 3, continuing my statement to the U.S. Senate, who must act as the sole judges in the decision whether to seat Al Franken based on an invalid election in Minnesota in 2014. He should not be seated because his election was the result of serious, material, and deliberate violation of provisions of Minnesota election law, including the U.S. Constitution. Although Minnesota Supreme Court Chief Justice Lori Gildea, Attorney General Lori Swanson, and Minnesota County Judge John Vandenorth are interfering to block the collection of evidence and its presentation to the U.S. Senate, I mailed it directly to the U.S. Senate Secretary before Christmas and asked her to distribute it to all the U.S. Senators for their use in the 114th Congressional Organization on January 6th. As in parts 1 and 2, I'm posting this video to U.S. Senate Twitter accounts for you and your staff to hear as you decide on this tomorrow. I've already exhausted all alternative procedures, including an election contest trial in Ramsey County pursuant to Minnesota law. However, the Minnesota courts impermissibly continue to bar this information from reaching you, the legitimate judges, and I base that on a reading of Morgan versus United States, a D.C. Circuit case. In part 1, I set out the serious, material, and deliberate violation ground that the DFL, having co-opted the Farmer Labor Party in the 40s, using the theme of communists in the Farmer Labor Party that dominated the Democratic state leadership by election and operation of the voting laws and Constitution, has now unconstitutionally insulated themselves against democracy by barring participation in voting based on race and gender and homosexual agendas and ideology. What I call the worst form of divided government. That is, government based on suspect classification, where the right to vote in the DFL precinct caucuses up to the state convention is determined based on voters' sex, based on their race or national origin, and based on sexual practices, which politically is called sexual preference, but this practice violates the conscience of many Minnesota voters, including mine. As I set out, this results in denial and abridgment of the voting rights of Minnesotans based on suspect classifications, based on sex against the 19th Amendment, and based on race against the 15th Amendment. This forced me out of the DFL. I could not run in the DFL primary against the woman incumbent who used voting rights, supposedly suppressed as part of her campaign. And the unconstitutional practice also barred me from campaigning at the DFL caucuses and conventions throughout the state to attract support in the Independence Party primary, August 12th. In part 2, I set out the serious, material, and deliberate violation ground that when I began to raise the quota practices in part 1 in my 2012 campaign for the U.S. House of Representatives, for instance, I started publicizing my rap video for Rap the Vote, saying, McCullum says she's fighting for voting rights, but her party's setting quotas for blacks and whites. She says she's representing all of Minnesota, but she really represents a Democrat quota. And I named it Make It Count. The refrain was, make it count. Let the voters govern. In our democratic system, you know you're the sovereign. Now, after I released this video and posted it on my website and on Twitter in 2012, Secretary Ritchie, a partisan DFL politician acting as the chief elections officer of the state, I say partisan since the legislative auditor found he took voter and donor email addresses home from the OSS office to raise funds for his own campaign in 2007 and those of other DFLers. And then in 2012, he intervened in my House campaign, again, as I was going against this quota practice, and he overruled years of practice of making the voter email addresses of registered voters available to all candidates as public information. This happened on October 29th in 2012, while the general election was on November 5th. Chief Judge Michael Davis of the Federal District Court refused to issue a summons or grant IFP until the last day before the election, and then denied a second TRO account. I am not a lawyer, but IFP and a summons should have issued immediately on filing October 30th. Finally, Davis entered an order refusing to enjoin the release of these HAVA voter email addresses, and then litigation ensued on grounds 1 and 2, what the Franken campaign calls the caucus claim and the email address claim. As I'll address more in part 4 of this series, the Minnesota courts blocked any action on this, and that they blocked a contest, and the Minnesota Supreme Court refused to consider this caucus claim and email voter claim on the grounds that McCollum was purportedly entitled to the office, and she would therefore be injured in her entitlement if these claims were considered by the U.S. House of Representatives. My rights under the First Amendment were protected against the actions of the DFL using the state to not only block political expression or political association directly, but under an important U.S. Supreme Court precedent regarding the First Amendment rights of independent voters and their political expression and association in the Independent Party. That case is Anderson versus Celebrezze from 1983. And the measure of Senator Franken's actions in violation of that First Amendment and deliberate violation by his party in the state of Minnesota is this. Does the action in question, and here the question is the state of Minnesota's actions under the laws prescribed by the Minnesota legislature to determine the time, place, and manner of the election as required by the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 4. Does this state action or inaction unreasonably burden the First Amendment rights of the independent voters, the independent candidate, and here the Independent Party, and our nominee for the U.S. Senate contestant? If it does, then the state needs to justify that action or inaction, and it has not and cannot. And so each of these grounds involves not only actions by Senator Franken or his campaign or the DFL party and its members and candidates, but by the state of Minnesota, including the DFL Secretary of State, Mark Ritchie, Attorney General Lori Swanson, and the Minnesota courts, Judge Vandenorth and his panel, Chief Justice Lori Gildea and the Minnesota Supreme Court, and by Judge Elena Ostby and the Ramsey County clerks denying the 2012 contest and blocking it there, holding it up there until it became moot. Each of these were state actions violating the First Amendment by unreasonably burdening exercise of free speech. Now in Anderson, John Anderson, presidential candidate, was not allowed to file his petition to get on the ballot. That was the First Amendment right Anderson sought, and when Ohio denied it, Ohio violated the voting rights of the independent voters as the U.S. Supreme Court ruled. Now, in this contest against Al Franken and the conduct of his election in violation of the U.S. Constitution and the election laws prescribed by the legislature, each of the grounds have burdened impermissibly in violation of the First Amendment during the heat of an election contest, either political expression or political association. In this contest, in ground one, there is suppression of the right to campaign for office in the DFL and for my supporters as independent voters to be able to participate in both regardless of their sex and regardless of their race or other suspect classifications and be on the DFL voting delegation. And for all independent voters, regardless of sex or race, to participate and vote in the DFL precinct caucuses and conventions as guaranteed by our own Minnesota Constitution under elective franchise, Article 7. In ground two, it is the right of the independent voters and the Independence Party nominee for statewide office, or any voters or candidates, to communicate with each other through the voter emails the voters voluntarily provide to the Secretary of State. This would allow, and according to Nancy Bream of OSS, has for years allowed candidates to freely express their political positions, arguments, and qualifications to the voters. and for the independent voters, including the Independence Party candidates and nominees, to associate politically for the purpose of gaining office. The focus of this Part 3 video is Ground 3, the debate on debates, or the debate claim, as Franken calls it. It occurred just in 2014, while Grounds 1 and 2 continued unremedied into 2014. That is to say, in the instant election and membership decision before you tomorrow. This body, in passing the Communications Act, recognized the power and the danger of powerful interests like Al Franken manipulating the power of mass media during elections. And so, to protect the free flow of information during elections regulated by the Act, you included equal time requirements. But the real source of this fairness in political communication is not this body, but the First Amendment itself. This body has the power to codify and regulate that right in accordance with the U.S. Constitution. For the U.S. Constitution, quote, adopts the state, in this case Minnesota, qualification as the federal qualification for the voter. But his right to vote is based upon the Constitution and not upon the state law. And Congress has the constitutional power to pass laws for the free, pure, and safe exercise of this right. That is Ex parte Yarborough from 1884. Justice Miller, writing regarding the power of the Constitution and of this Congress to regulate congressional elections in the states for the free, pure, and safe exercise of the right to vote, enshrined in and based on the Constitution itself, and not the First Amendment alone. Part of that regulation is the empowerment of the Minnesota legislature to prescribe the time, place, and manner. And time and place would include debates, which occur at a specific time and place, and this body's regulation may not be ignored, nor may it be interpreted in a manner that runs afoul of the First Amendment. And the Communications Act was passed with the First Amendment protections in the equal time requirements in order for this body and the House of Representatives and the President to protect democracy against the monopolistic or dualistic power of parties with access to money and to the media, as Senator Franken enjoyed. Total control of the media environment achieved by refusing to debate until October 1st and then only with Mike McFadden. This is propaganda, using media of mass communications. This is not free and fair elections. It is not freedom of political expression or freedom of political association for independent voters. In fact, the mass media not only excluded my campaign, except for attacks and negative portrayals based upon supposed disqualification for office, but created viewpoint discrimination, which it amped up into media distortion of my views. And this aided Senator Franken, who never acknowledged that my major political party nomination existed. Where Senator Franken's wrong, though, is that he believed a free, fair, and pure election meeting the standards of this body and the U.S. Constitution, or even standards of Minnesota election law, could be conducted in this way. Yes, an event occurred, but it was not a democratic election, and this was the intended outcome by Franken and his party and campaign. Throughout the 2014 general election season, beginning within days of my winning the Independence Party primary, August 12th of last year, the mass media, particularly the public radio station in Minnesota called Minnesota Public Radio and Associated Press, and stories carried by all the internet and print media, attempted to disqualify me as the winner. My name appeared at the top of the general election ballot, however, and so this was a major story in the general election season. It needed to be explained away why the name at the top of everyone's ballot, statewide, was not attached to a nominee who was allowed to participate in the election. Beginning with attacks as the voter's choice, attacks on me as the voter's choice for the IP election, beating Kevin Terrell, the endorsed candidate, and then throughout the general election, all voters knew about me is that I was disqualified or disowned as the nominee because of my supposedly incorrect views on homosexual marriage. I believe the DFL statute establishing so-called marriage is unconstitutional federally and violates the freedom of conscience provision in the Minnesota Constitution. And my position on legalization of marijuana. The IP party in 2014 took a position that marijuana should be legalized fully and taxed, and I did not participate and do not agree. My own position on these issues, which it was reported, quote, do not begin to meet the high standards of the IP members quoted in the press, are protective of the civil rights of people regardless of their sexual practices and treating drugs as a health problem. So I would not throw people in jail for smoking marijuana, but treat the health problems it causes, including the abuse. But NPR went further, stressing that the reason I was disqualified by the party was views I had allegedly expressed regarding the Trayvon Martin tragedy, the Todd Akin controversy from 2012, and comments I agreed with that there is a war on white men. And I was specifically referring to the voter quotas in Minnesota and across the country that take away the right to vote from white men and Democrat machinery of election. NPR insisted, and their reporter Tom Scheck still insists on Wikipedia, that I said it was a valuable public service to kill Trayvon Martin. So supposedly I was a super racist. However, as I repeatedly explained to Scheck and directed him to his own posting on my Facebook page saying this, was that I believe George Zimmerman should not be killed. This was the context of discussion in the aftermath of the Florida verdict. Because by being a kind of neighborhood watch person during a rash of burglaries in his neighborhood, he provided a valuable public service. And also, he was attacked and defended himself. I also made statements that Darrell Wilson, as a police officer, provided a valuable public service and should not have been attacked with his own gun. In contrast, Senator Franken wanted Wilson indicted as, quote, justice for the Brown family, unquote, all as part of a campaign. So my views are centrist, not racist, and I am concerned about rising attacks on police officers spurred on by politics. I want peace, security, and real equal opportunity. We can't have real equal opportunity if we can't have peace and security. In an NPR debate with Mike Mulcahy moderating with Denny McCullum, because I thank God I could be at the debate, a caller called in with a question directed to me about Todd Akin's comments about rape and abortion. I pointed out that it's important that no one, including Todd Akin, said rape is legitimate. This is a perfectly reasonable and I think important position because it was being bandied about that senators thought rape is legitimate. For this, I was said to defend Akin's statement that when rape occurs, pregnancy does not result, and so abortion is not justified. I do not defend that position. I understand Akin's position that abortion, taking the life of the resulting fetus, should not be allowed even if it is the result of a rape. I don't support that position at all as a matter of law. The government should not force that and align itself in any way with rape. But in 2014, after I won the primary, NPR spread all around the nation that I defended Akin's comments, when all I did was clarify that rape is not legitimate. Betty McCullum responded that rape is rape and my comments were offensive. My positions or responses to these press attacks were never let out to the voters, and this included publicly broadcast debates, where voters could have learned my positions. All voters could know about me in 2014. Some knew me as the CD4 Congressional District 4 candidate from televised debates in 2010 and 2012, including my musical compositions and performances such as Make It Count. Unless they visited my Twitter account or Facebook page, my White House group discussions on LinkedIn, or my website, stevecarlsonforcongress2010.com, they wouldn't know what my real views were. The only connection ever publicized about my relationship as a nominee with Senator Franken, apart, of course, from being at the top of the ballot, which people tended to see near the last day, is that Franken would never acknowledge, it was reported, that I existed or comment at all about my campaign. In addition, NPR, and I call this the nihilistic approach, annihilation, meaning the opponent is nothing, it does not exist. Now, in addition, NPR accommodated Franken by canceling all state fair debates, including the debate for my Senate campaign, and then adding on a third and final meeting between Franken and Republican Mike McFadden at the end of the campaign, which was billed as a debate, a U.S. Senate candidate debate, even though as the major party nominee of the IP, could not be included or mentioned. And the IP, by the way, is a party that needs 5% in a statewide race to remain on the ballot, and has now lost it, according to the results of this contested election with Al Franken. I was not, as the media said, invited by Mr. Franken. So Franken orchestrated this so-called election and so-called debate to suit himself. Some in the media, such as Doug Belden of the Pioneer Press, called this fitting, this supposed entitlement of Franken to manipulate the debates. Into this hostile media environment, Senator Franken, in his bid for re-election, superimposed his orchestrated meetings with Mike McFadden, concentrated in the last month of the campaign, October 1st, October 26th, and November 2nd, the NPR meeting, while the vote was November 4th in this year. While I had hoped to bring a petition to the Minnesota Supreme Court early regarding the quotas and denial of public information, seeking to get the email addresses and to clarify the unconstitutionality of the quotas and denial of voting rights based on individual rights as opposed to the group rights recognized by the Democrats, I was forced to divert virtually all my campaign energies to seek to get in the debates and present my views excluded from those debates, to let the voters know my positions, arguments, and qualifications. This included legal research on equal time requirements and the First Amendment, contacts to the debate broadcasters to determine if I was really excluded. Duluth News Tribune was the only media to answer my question. NPR and WCCO never responded, but at the WCCO debate, CBS Broadcasting had directed a security guard to bar my entrance into the building. That was my notification. The Duluth News Tribune, whose debate programming was broadcast by KBMR, I believe KBJR TV, Superior Duluth, a licensed broadcaster by the FCC, explained to me, and I recorded it, and it's on my YouTube account, that it was decided long ago with Senator Franken and the others that because Democrats and Republicans control all or virtually all of the Senate, no Independence Party nominee would be allowed to participate in the debate. So it was on a purely partisan basis that I would not be allowed to participate. Now again, WCCO never responded to me. But when I filed a petition with the Minnesota Supreme Court and a motion for injunction to allow me in the debate, CBS Broadcast responded with their own motion to dismiss and based their position on polling data as interpreted by Larry Jacobs of the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute, a famous Democrat who actually helped to start this quota system, which I call unconstitutional, in an argument which led to my being denied voter email addresses and being barred from debates and subject to a barrage of falsehoods by NPR and Associated Press. Now, NPR never responded, and their viewpoint discrimination and distortion was obvious. But NPR was also the defendant in Moore versus NPR in 2002, a Minnesota District Court case that said Michael Moore, IP nominee for U.S. Senate, could be excluded by NPR in a debate between Walter Mondale and Norm Coleman upon the tragic death of Senator Paul Wellstone. The practice of excluding our major party, as Senator Franken did, is explained by Duluth News Tribune because of the reason that Democrats and Republicans control virtually all the seats in the U.S. Senate, is not allowed by the equal time requirements. So I filed a complaint with the FCC political office and waited for the disposition, then sued in the Minnesota Supreme Court to get in the October 26th and November 2nd debates, based on both the First Amendment and equal time provisions. However, the court refused to act, saying it had no jurisdiction, and equitable remedies granted to Betty McCollum in a post-election contest barred the raising of the constitutional violations in grounds 1 and 2 in a petition in the U.S. Senate race. After that, the clock was running out, but I did file a motion for a stay to enjoin my participation in the final debate in MPR. It was physically hand-delivered by a courier through the U.S. Supreme Court, directed to Justice Stephen Breyer, 2 days before the debate. But the Supreme Court tells me he never got it until 2 days after the debate. It is being held there pending my filing of a motion or a petition for certiorari on this case. This U.S. Senate is part of that judicial proceeding, but the decision on the seating or non-seating of Senator Franken is the purview of this body alone and will be moved. However, the review of the constitutionality of your action, as I understand it, is reviewable by the U.S. Supreme Court. Thank you for watching part 3 of this video directed at the U.S. Senate. It is being tweeted to all U.S. Senator and U.S. Senate Twitter feeds I can find. I must quickly produce and post part 4, focusing on the unconstitutionality of the actions and inactions of Minnesota courts in this election, a pattern begun with the 2012 blocking of the Betty McCollum election contest.